you have any other issues. Thank you for letting me start off your meeting here. I don't know if everybody is up to speed on the situation, but Better Be, the company that I work for, decided that I should go to Copenhagen this week for the Abemondia conference. So I am, it is now 12:38 a.m. here in Copenhagen, and I am in a tiny Danish hotel room, and I'm not going to be quite as loud as I normally would because my boss is sleeping in a bed just on the other side of that wall. So I hope that everybody is looking forward to learning about bee nutrition. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak to you all. I think I will just click a few buttons and get right into my slides. Again, please interrupt and let me know if anything isn't working properly. So we'll click over to this, do that, and oh, you know what? I'm not going to do that. Bear with me. I've only done this 1,000 times before. There we go. And if I do this, splendid. All right, so can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Wave your hands around wildly, so because I can only see you. Very good. Like you tiny little people on the side of the screen. My name is David Peck. I am the Director of Research and Education at Better Be in upstate New York. I got my PhD at Cornell studying Professor Tom Steele. My focus is on honeybee and varroa mite behavior, but in my role at Better Be, I have a sort of a wide-reaching mission to educate beekeepers about bees, about bee biology, about beekeeping best practices, and I also conduct research in my role, which helps to keep me on the cutting edge of exciting, interesting stuff to talk to you guys about. So this is a talk that I really like giving, which is all about honeybee nutrition. And I say that, but it's a little bit of a fib, because it's about bee digestion. I like this strategy of taking a little step back from the very simple applied question. All right, tell me about nutrition. Tell me what I should feed my bees today to make them healthier. I take a step back, and what this is a series of topics related to the way that our bees get nutrients, get food, and turn it into the energy and the building blocks of their own lives that they actually need. And I think that at the end of this, you'll wind up with some deeper understanding of and insights into your bees, which will make you a better beekeeper at the end. So the way we're going to do this is we're basically going to use this illustration of the honeybee digestive tract, which was drawn by R.E. Snodgrass as our roadmap. We're going to sort of take a little waltz through the honeybee digestive tract, and I can tell you, having dissected a number of bees myself, they never look quite as neat and tidy when you have them sitting there on the microscope as they do in Snodgrass's drawings. So this is a nice, clean way for us to look at and talk about the different parts of the digestive tracts that these bees are using as they're digesting these foods that they eat. And so there's to perhaps oversimplify things. Over here on the left, we can see the very complicated mouth parts of the bees, but generally bees are going to be drinking most of their food using their very hairy tongue. It's going to pass down into their crop or their honey stomach, which is then going to continue through a valve and allow the bees to extract nutrients from all of the wonderful things that they've consumed. It goes, as in most insects, from the foregut to the midgut to the hindgut. Instead of having a large and small intestine, this is the way that we describe these different structures. And so we're going to explore all of these different mechanisms and hopefully wind up better beekeepers at the end of it. So I'll start with the Malpighian tubules, which are at least partially related to digestion. And the Malpighian tubules are illustrated here in this diagram as what look like a bunch of spaghetti noodles. So what these tubules are that run all throughout the bee's body and then connect to the intestine is essentially the kidney of our bees. It doesn't look much like a kidney, but it behaves very much like it. It's these tubes that travel throughout the bee's body, and they collect excess water and salts and wastes, and they drain all of those things down into the gut of the bee so they can be expelled. So they're moving the material from the hemolymph directly into the intestine, because there is no bloodstream inside of a bee, so there's no bloodstream to be filtered by something like our kidneys. And so that's why these things don't look anything like a human kidney, but they do have that same basic function. So these bees that have excess water, salts, wastes, all need to have them taken out of their bodies and excreted. And so we've now done at least a small portion of bee digestion on one slide. That's what the Malpighian tubules are. Before we get into more detail about adult digestion, I do like to start with a little discussion of larval digestion. So for this, we're actually going to use a different scientific illustrator, J.A. Nelson's illustrations. And here we can see that obviously things are very much simplified. Food goes in through the mouth. It goes into the basically swollen middle intestine. The foregut is basically absent. That middle intestine is this big long tube that the food is going to go into, and it's going to extract all the great nutrients out of it. And behind that, we can see the hind intestine, this little coil down near the bottom of the larva. There are also a couple of Malpighian tubules that you can see, and a silk gland that runs down from these mouth parts into its body. It's going to synthesize the silk that they use to spin their cocoon. What's interesting about larval digestion is that these larvae are eating. They're eating machines. They're being fed constantly by nurses, and they're eating and eating and growing and growing. But what's interesting is that they don't actually excrete any of that waste. And that's because larval honeybees have learned that all-important lesson that you should excrete where you eat. And so they hold in all of this digestive waste. And essentially, they have to grow their body fast enough so that their intestine can accommodate the ever-growing pile of bee feces that they have not actually expelled, because they wouldn't want to do that right into the brood food that they're feeding on. It does need to go somewhere eventually, though. And so during the prepupal phase, when the larva stands up straight, the hindgut and the midgut, which haven't actually been connected to each other, finally grow together, and then all of this feces is accumulated rather is liberated rather dramatically out of the rear end of the bee. And so what's happening is that larva is doing somersaults to spin its cocoon, and as it does that, it's also going to go through a period of time where it's excreting all of that digestive waste. And then it'll spin a little more cocoon. So this is a close-up photo that was shot by another research team, which I really like, where we can see this big, fat, prepupal larva, which as beekeepers, we would see standing up and getting ready to be capped. And then we open up those caps and we see that we've got pupae inside, and then eventually they chew their way out. And so beekeepers don't often realize just how acrobatic these larvae have to be before pupation begins. So this larva is rotating around, spinning this very, very flimsy silken cocoon around itself inside of the cell. And luckily the video cuts out before we get to the next part where they excrete all that digestive waste. But this is the process in which it happens, and it literally is a somersault of excretion. And so if we've ever wondered why brood comb becomes a brown color over time, we maybe need to look no further than this for our answer. So what's happening in that pupation process? Well, this isn't a honeybee, obviously, it's a fly, but the principles are the same. That as this insect goes from larval form through its pupal form into its adult form, it is not simply taking the head of the larva and growing a new head from it, or the center of the larva and growing the thorax, or the rear end and growing the abdomen. Instead, they have these structures called imaginal discs. And the imaginal discs are these little colored illustrated blobs over here on the side, and we can see that in the adult insect, they're forming these big, complicated, important structures. The eye, doesn't come from whatever the larva has for light sensors. It instead grows from these little clusters that have basically been doing nothing in the larval body that have to grow up into the eye of the adult. And so what this means is that if a larva has absorbed any toxins from its food, then those toxins have the potential to have a very, very small effect on a very small number of cells. But if those cells are very important because they grow into something like the wings or the legs or the brain of the bee, then there's a great risk that a small amount of toxin can have an outsized impact on the adult bee. So this is one of the reasons that it's so important that bees are fed a minimally toxic diet, even more so than something like a human, because we aren't completely reinventing entire organ structures as we grow. So what is it that these bees are eating? Well, most of the essential nutrients that bees consume are derived from pollen. There's a very small number that come from nectar. Obviously, the calories, for the most part, come from nectar. But basically, everything else that the bees get comes from pollen. And there's a number of different things. There are essential vitamins, B vitamins, and vitamin C. You know, I don't know that a bee could get scurvy, but they would certainly get sick if they didn't consume vitamin C. They have a whole list of essential amino acids, things that their body can't synthesize, just like we do. And in fact, as we look at this list, all of these amino acids are the exact same amino acids that human bodies can't synthesize. The only difference is bees are also unable to synthesize arginine. And it turns out our bodies actually aren't very good at synthesizing arginine. And so a lot of nutritionists and doctors think that we should consider arginine also an essential amino acid. If we don't get it from our diet, we're just not going to make enough to really keep our health where it needs to be. The pollen is providing all of the fats, all of the fatty acids, all the minerals that these bees need. And it's very important that bees get the right quantities of some of these very small trace minerals. Bees need salt, for example, but if you add just a very small percent of salt to sugar syrup that is fed to bees, you start to notice that their lifespans are reduced. And so they badly need the right amount of salt, but they also very seriously suffer if they get too much of it. So the reason that the bees are eating all of this pollen, and then basically all of their nutrition comes from it, is that bees can be thought of as vegetarian wasps. This is the way that many entomologists think about them. They consider both honeybees and the other 23,000 species of bees in the world as essentially, their ancient cousins, the wasps, were happily flying around, eating caterpillars and feeding them to their larvae. And the bees decided on a different strategy. The bees grew these fuzzy hairs all over their body that increases their surface area, and it causes static electricity that makes pollen stick to them. And instead of getting their protein from eating other insects, they get their protein from pollen. So if you are a wasp, these are Vespa velutina, the horribly invasive yellow-legged hornet. But if you were a social wasp like them, you would have what's called a social stomach. You go out as an adult, you forage for nectar, you forage for caterpillar protein, and you chew those things up and you feed them to these larvae. And then if you need a little food, you can go to the larvae yourself and get a mouthful back from the larva sitting there with its mouth facing you. And so they're able to exchange food back and forth that way. If things get really dire and they run out of protein, they will cannibalize some of those larvae. What happens if our bees run out of protein in the hive? Well, in dire circumstances, we will see them doing the same thing. They will bite the head off of the pupa, and they'll drink all of its fluids out, and they'll use that protein to go and feed other larvae. So instead of letting them all starve, they'll sacrifice some to keep the other fed. And so essentially what this is a way that bees store protein. They feed it to some larvae now, but then they say, all right, we actually need some of this back. But luckily, this is a pretty rare occurrence. And the reason for that is that our bees have the ability to store protein in their hive in a different way. And that's in the form of bee bread. Bee bread, or stored pollen, is a mixture of pollen, bee salivary enzymes and microbes, and also some nectar or honey that gets mixed in and added to it. So it undergoes a process of fermentation. It's actually two different kinds of fermentation. Bacterial fermentation, or lactic acid bacterial fermentation, as well as yeast fermentation, which produces alcohol as a byproduct. And so both of these groups of microbes are acting on these honey-saturated pollen grains, and they are doing a couple of things. They're primarily preserving pollen. They're digesting all of the easy-to-get stuff that nasty molds and funguses might try to consume. And they're also providing some of these preservative compounds like lactic acid and alcohol. There's some amount of pre-digestion that takes place. There's a thought that maybe it's important that this food be fermented so that the bees can digest it more easily, although there's not a lot of evidence to support that. It does break down some of the starches, which bees don't really metabolize very well, but for the most part, that's just because the yeast and the bacteria are really good at breaking those things down. For the most part, this is just a storage mechanism. When a bee first chews her way out of her cell, she's going to stretch her wings, stretch her legs, look around, and within about 2 hours, she's going to take her first mouthful of pollen. She'll chew up some of the bee bread that the colony has stored. The pollen consumption will peak at 5 days after emergence, and then bees consume almost no pollen after they have been emerged for about 10 days. And this makes sense, because why does a bee need to consume protein? Well, for the most part, it's so that they can digest it and turn it into brood food. And so the youngest bees who serve as nurses are going to need to get that pollen, that protein into their bodies so they can make the high protein brood food that they will then feed as royal jelly or other larval jellies to help these bees develop. Now, what's interesting about this whole process is that a plant, a flower, is making nectar as a gift to pollinating insects. It's basically a bribe to those insects to have them move pollen from flower to flower. They are not offering the pollen as a gift. The pollen is the reproductive cell of that plant, and it has, as far as the plant's concerned, a very important thing to do, and it's not getting eaten by a bunch of bees. So they actually have a very complex protective system around these grains of pollen because they don't want it to be taken and eaten. Bees, therefore, have to rely on a pretty complicated system of chemical trickery to convince those pollen granules to open up so that the bees can then go in and digest all the good stuff inside. And so the mechanisms are quite widely varied. Part of it is that they induce what we call pseudo-germination. They basically convince the pollen that it's on a female part of the flower and it should open up, and then they realize their mistake. There's some disruption of the cell wall of certain kinds of pollens. The bees can kind of grind up a little bit. There are enzymes that go in and break down the pollen grains and get access to the goodies inside. And there's also the use of osmotic shock. Basically, as the pollen grains are put into parts of the bee's digestive tract that have either very high salt content or very low salt content, it causes water to osmotically rush in or rush out, and it will rupture the cell wall, and then all of the nutrients will leak out. So all of this talk of pollen digestion is interesting, but how important is it? How much do we really need to know about this? And so I will put forward this question. Do you think that it could actually be very important? Do you think that studying pollen digestion in honeybees could stop World War III? By show of hands, yay, nay, do you think this is plausible? What if I told you that it's already happened? So yellow ring was an alleged chemical weapon that the Soviets were supposed to be using on US allied refugees in Southeast Asia who were fleeing the Vietnam War. And this is a photograph from the Department of Defense of yellow ring, these little particles of yellow stuff that fell on these refugees, and there were claims that people were getting sick and that it was dropping from the sky, so it must be coming from these high-flying airplanes. And that was used to really start to beat the drums of war, to try to say the US is now facing direct attacks by the Soviet Union, therefore the only way that we can stop them is to directly attack the Soviets. We need to take the US to war with the communists. But what was interesting was that when samples of this yellow ring were given to teams of independent scientists, and those scientists were varied, but they included a number of Harvard scientists and one junior faculty member at Yale, Tom Seeley, who was my doctoral advisor when I was at Cornell. So he studied at Harvard and then moved to Yale and then took a job at Cornell. So he's been to all the Ivies. He went to Princeton for his undergraduate college degree. So he's certainly not plumbing it. But all of these scientists together worked on some of these samples. They offered the alternative. They said a remarkable finding in all samples of yellow ring we know to have been examined is that they contain a high proportion of pollen. Honeybees almost never defecate in their nest, but instead do so in flight. Their excrement consists largely of the walls of pollen consumed from stores in the nest. So they said, we think that these bees are just going out and pooping, and it's being misinterpreted as a weapon. And so they said the pollen that has been identified thus far is from plant families common in Southeast Asia. So it's not like it's Russian pollen that's showing up in the wrong spot. The families, the plant families, are mostly insect pollinated, not wind pollinated. So they're not going to orchard crops that have a lot of pollen and then collecting. They're actually getting the stuff that bees are visiting. The US government investigators speculate that bee pollen is being used as a carrier for toxins. However, in size, shape, color, texture, and high pollen content, the spots of yellow rain very closely resemble the natural excretions of bees from the genus Apis. And so this publication really took the wind out of the sails of the war hawks that were trying to push this narrative that we needed to attack the Soviets. And this careful understanding of bee digestion may have actually prevented the US from an open armed conflict. So let's take it back to the apiary. How does this affect us? Well, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that if we're feeding our bees extra protein, supplemental protein, at any point in the year, we should ask, should we be feeding them pollen or non-pollen protein? So the advantage of something that isn't pollen is that it's basically easy protein, right? It's protein that doesn't have all of those cell walls. They don't need to use all those mechanisms to open it up. But is that good, or is it better for the bees to use their digestive tracts the way that they're supposed to be used? Are they supposed to be eating this pollen that sort of plays hard to get with the digestive system? It requires all of that extra work to actually get all the goodness out of them. It is important, we can't fall down the road that natural is always better, because even natural pollen sometimes is missing really important nutrients that bees need to consume. If you are feeding your bees a protein patty or a pollen patty, that is typically going to be mostly sugar and water. It's a sugar-water fondant paste, and it's going to have some protein added to it. Some of them add a lot, some of them add a little bit, and some add a medium amount. And some of that protein includes bee pollen, and some of it doesn't. And so there's a very, very wide range to what exactly is offered to these bees when we give them a protein patty. And the consequences of consuming something that's very, very natural or very, very far from nature still aren't very well understood. So with that, I want to move on to the mouth parts of our bees. And we can see all of these beautiful, complicated mouth structures. But essentially, the core of the bee's oral digestive tract, or here we go, ingestion system, is right here. It's the long, hairy tongue. So the tongue is called a glossa, and the hairs on it are called setae. And the setae, these hairs on the tongue, are used to absorb a great deal of liquid as these bees are trying to drink it. It's a huge surface area that then wicks up all of that moisture. So all of the rest of the mouth parts are in many ways just a support structure for what this glossa is meant to do. And what that means is that adult bees, with the exception of the ones chewing up a little pollen so they can feed it to the brood, bees are meant to drink their food. Now, this is important in winter because we find ourselves as beekeepers often having to give supplemental sugar to our bees. And at certain times of year, at least where I live, and I think, for at least portions of the winter, most winters where you are, the bees can't really hold in the extra moisture that comes along with sugar syrup. So if your bees don't have enough honey to consume, you may wind up having to give them sugar bricks or fondant or winter patties or something like that instead. So there's all sorts of products, as I say, that are designed to feed bees in the winter. A solid sugar or a semi-solid sugar, sort of a sugary, watery paste that is going to go into the colony and is going to allow them to get those calories that they need. But we can ask ourselves, what is the consequence of these bees who are supposed to be consuming a liquid suddenly consuming a much more solid diet? And there's a really, really beautiful study that was done in China in 2020, or rather published in 2020, where they took these bees and they put these super, super focused, super, super high-speed cameras on them, and they watched as these bees were licking blocks of sugar. And so they did a few different things. First, they compared how many grams of sugar the bees could get if they were drinking it. This is the bar over here on the right, and they found that on average the bees could get about 13 grams of sugar consumed during the test period, or if they were just consuming the solid block. And this little box down here, you might think is the number of grams they can consume. It isn't. That's actually just to tell you that they needed to zoom in order to illustrate that these bees in the same time period were only able to consume about 0.035 grams of that sugar. So clearly this is a less efficient process, but the bees have a lot of time to kill as they're sitting up there in the winter cluster trying to stay alive. And so maybe this isn't that bad. Here's a lovely video that shows this bee actually drinking or licking and then dissolving with her saliva and then finally drinking up a tiny amount of sugar from one of these sugar crystals. So what we're seeing here is the groove that this bee's tongue has carved into that crystal. And so she's going to stick her tongue down in there, she expands those hairs, and she actually releases a little bit of saliva. She releases it in order to dissolve things, and then after a small amount of dissolving has happened, she pulls her tongue back and receives a little bit of sugar as a reward. And so both of those were very, very slowed down, high-speed videos, but we can see the process through which these bees would slowly, over time, excavate those little sugar tongues. They did further research on the way that the bees actually used the different parts of their tongues during the dry sugar and the sugar syrup consumption. And the real take-home message here is that, one cycle of consuming sugar from syrup was about 220 milliseconds, whereas one cycle of trying to absorb sugar from the crystals was about 600 milliseconds. So the end result is that the net energy that the bees got from solid sugar was less than from sucrose, from sugar syrup. And that was because they simply had to put a lot more into extracting that sugar and getting it into their bodies than dipping their tongue into a little puddle of syrup. Well, how important is this, right? How relevant is it that these bees are experiencing some wear to their seeding? As bees get older, they get worn down hairs, worn down seeding. And in fact, if you feed bees more concentrated diets, both liquid diets, nothing solid in this case, but in another study, they fed them 45% sugar syrup versus 35% sugar syrup. And they found that the ones fed the denser syrup experienced detectably more wear to their seeding over time. But they also found that the older bees with the worn down seeding just sipped faster. They dipped their tongues in faster in order to compensate for the fact that the tongues didn't work quite as well. And so their argument, the suggestion here, is that it may not be all that important that our bees, even our beloved winter bees, are wearing down their seeding, licking all of that solid sugar. Because even though there is a consequence, the bees have a complicated mechanism to compensate for it. And by the time those bees have raised a generation of brood to take over, and they're going to their last reward, they would probably have been able to get the colony through into the spring, even though it was slightly less efficient for them to get food out of a dandelion flower. The other thing to remember, of course, is that solid sugar, the emergency winter feed, is the replacement fuel that your bees need to keep themselves warm. That's their heater fuel. And so if you open a hive in the middle of a blizzard, they might die because it may just be more than they can bear. But if they run out of fuel, they're going to die. They will starve and freeze to death. And so if you're given the choice between possibly hurting the bees by disturbing them and wearing down their tongues a little bit, or definitely having them starve to death, the best option is still to give them the solid feed. But this research suggests that it may be beneficial for us to be careful about shifting our bees to that solid diet if we can avoid it. Now, when we do feed our bees sugar, whether it be solid or syrup that we've made, it's important that we only feed them refined sugar, highly refined sugar. Domino's granulated sugar is what you're looking for. Does it matter if it's refined from beets or if it's refined from sugarcane? Absolutely not. Doesn't matter at all. Because they're both so highly processed that there's basically nothing in those bags except sugar crystals. They're both sucrose crystals. They're both perfectly fine for bees. Where you can get yourself in trouble is when you try to be clever. You try to give your bees something more natural, something like maple syrup or this sugar in the raw, this minimally processed cane sugar. Because, look, it's brown. It's sort of like the whole wheat flour of sugar, right? Surely that must be better for my bees. No. And the reason is that these all have substantially higher ash contents. And this is something that you'll often hear in beekeeping, school or in a bee book. It'll say you don't want these high ash honeys. But we don't always define what ash is. So what is ash? Well, ash is something that you get from an ash analysis of something. And so in this case, we might take a sugar or a honey sample or something like that. And we're going to take the sample and we'll put it into a chamber where we're going to increase the temperature. We're going to give it as much oxygen as it wants. And we're just going to burn anything that will burn. And what happens is we wind up burning off all of the carbons and oxygens and hydrogens and nitrogens that are available for burning. And we're left with the ash, essentially all of the minerals, the things that didn't want to burn away in that heating chamber. So all of the sodium and all of the calcium and all of the iron that was in that specimen, no matter how little there is going to contribute to the ash residue. And if we look at different honeys, we can characterize the ash. We can even start to make guesses about how much ash there is just based on the color. And so over here, we have a table on the left and then a graph on the right. And they're both showing the same basic thing, that lighter honeys, light honey versus dark honey in the table, or honey running the gamut from water white to light amber to dark, have increasing levels of these different minerals in them as the darkness of the honey increases. And so some of them vary quite widely. We can see potassium is hugely different, almost an order of magnitude different from light to dark honey. Something like calcium might be almost identical. So not everything increases, but a lot of these things do. And the end result here is that you might have 461 parts per million of these different minerals in a very light honey, whereas you might have 2,200 parts per million in a darker honey. And these have a consequence, because that ash in the bees' guts can affect how they digest it and how their digestion progresses. Dark honeys, especially fall honeys that tend to be darker in both areas, tend to have a higher ash content. And so there's some concern that if your bees are being overwintered by eating all of that ash honey, high ash honey, they may have more bulk in their guts. They may have higher levels of dysentery if they're not able to go out on a cleansing flight. Honeydew honey often has an even higher mineral content, higher ash content. Now, this isn't always true of all honeydews, but it is true of many of them. So, forgive me for not having looked this up, but has the spotted lanternfly arrived where you are or not? Hands up if it has.
Yes.
Sounds like no. Good. Maybe yes. But if it's not there, it's coming. It's spreading rapidly and aggressively, and they are an absolute biblical plague when they show up, at least the first year when they really boom in population. What we can see here, though, is a honeybee who is drinking honeydew, the excreted, pooped out sugar water that these spotted lanternflies are extracting from this plant they're feeding on. Now, bees will happily collect that, bring it back, evaporate the extra water, and store it just like honey. And that honeydew honey has the potential to be problematic because suddenly the bees have access to this new sugar source, but that sugar also has potentially high levels of ash, something that will change the way that they digest it through the winter. Now, it is important to remember that ash isn't necessarily the enemy. Ash is still needed. Ash is all of those critical minerals that bees need to have to be healthy. And so this was a nice company that was a research project that was done in the 70s, where these scientists fed these bees an artificial diet that they had mixed up, and they just changed the amount of ash. It's basically these different minerals over here on the side. And what they measured was the total brood areas, square centimeters of brood that the bees were able to produce. And what you'll see is that when they turned the ash from 0.5% to 1%, the amount of brood increased because the bees were doing better with that amount. However, when they went up to 2%, 4%, 8%, the amount of brood decreased because that was too much ash, too many of these minerals, and the bees wound up suffering for it. But it's important that when they fed them a diet that contained absolutely no ash, they had a performance that was almost the same as when they were fed way, way more ash than was healthy for them. So the ideal amount, this optimal amount, might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1%, whereas if you feed them nothing, it's as bad as if you were feeding them 4%, or nearly as bad as if they were fed 8%. So we have to remember that the minerals in this ash are important. The dark honey is not poison to your bees. It's just that the darker honeys may have the potential to cause some digestive issues, especially if the bees can't take cleansing flights and get rid of that extra stuff. So what is honey? This is the next topic I want us to explore a little bit. We spend all of this time talking about it, thinking about it, and extracting it, and selling it, and eating it. But what is honey? Well, there's a school of thought. It's certainly a popular school of thought if you're teaching 13-year-old boys about honeybees, that honey is just bee bark, right? That any child who learns that bees regurgitate the honey as part of the process of making it are going to fixate on that fact for a little while. And so we can ask ourselves, how true is this? Is honey just bee bark? Well, we have to talk a little bit more about how it's made to decide if that's a fair way to characterize it. And to do that, we need to really focus on the honey stomach. Because yes, the sugar goes into the bee's body and then it comes back out of their body. But what's happening inside? Is it being digested or not? Well, the honey stomach, this front portion of the digestive tract, is this beautiful organ which is specialized to help bees transport liquids. It expands and contracts as needed, so the bees can control what's inside of it. It's blocked by this valve called the proventriculus here. This valve is going to actually prevent the sugar inside from passing into the bee's digestive tract. If a bee needs a little bit of nutrient, she'll take a big mouthful of honey or a mouthful of nectar, and then she'll allow a little bit of it to pass down into her digestive tract. But for the most part, she's simply going to hold it there, and the valve will keep it separated from the rest of her digestion. So this is really a storage vessel, and it's a reaction vessel where some of the enzymes in the bee's saliva can start to act on that nectar and change it to start its process of turning into honey. Now, if we look at these two different bees, we can see a pretty obvious difference in their abdomens. This bee over here on the left has, you might notice, a great big metal pin sticking out of her back because she has been killed by an entomologist, not me, I'm not responsible for this. And you can see that as she dried out, her abdomen really shrunk. This bee has a very, very small abdomen. This bee over here on the side, you might almost be forgiven for thinking it was a queen because that abdomen is so large, so distended. And that's because she's a food storage bee who's doing her job of storing food. These overlapping plates on the abdomens of our bees essentially allow the whole abdomen to telescope into itself or to expand back out as that honey stomach, that crop, is expanded or contracted, filled or emptied of liquids. And so these tergites on the back and these sternites on the back, the overlapping armored plates that keep the bee's abdomen safe, are going to, when the bee is not totally engorged with food, overlap with one another. If we look down here on the bottom, we can see these overlapping armored plates. The space in between those plates or underneath those plates is quite important because one of the things that it does is it allows the bees to produce beeswax. The wax glands themselves are in that space in between those sternites. The other thing, though, is that it provides a perfect hiding spot for varroa mites. Varroa mites' preferred spot on a bee's body is wedged right up underneath a pair of those sternites, so that the bees are unable to groom them out with their legs. So what is this honey stomach all about? Well, it's essentially about the division of labor within the bee colony. So the bees have two different jobs that they need to do, just like anyone. They need to acquire food, and then they need to put that food away. So in a human family, you might have somebody who's really good at acquiring food, knows where all of the sales are, they know how to get a good deal, they know just where to get the right stuff that everyone wants to eat. But then when they come home, it would be a waste of that expert shopper's time to go and put all of the food away. Better to have a younger member of the family tasked with that, so the shopper can go back out there and find some more, discount hams and beans to bring home for the family to store for the winter. And so this is essentially what's happening inside of the colony. The honey stomach is basically the reusable shopping bag for a honeybee. And in order to emphasize that, I want to show you the difference between the worker honey stomach over here on the left and the queen and drone honey stomachs in the middle. Those are both basically vestigial. They don't function, they don't really expand or contract very much. Their function is simply to allow that food to get down and then wait to be passed into the digestive tract for consumption. Whereas these workers are really working the honey stomach as this specialized storage organ. And so just like the little shopping metaphor I used, you've got bees that are specialists on going out and finding flowers, visiting flowers, manipulating the flowers, moving their heads into just the right spot that they can absorb all the nectar from the flowers. And then the other bees, younger bees, who are in charge of food storage. They're trusted to take the food regurgitated by the forager and then to pack it away into the cells. And so that food is exchanged in a process called trophallaxis. One bee standing mouth to mouth, head to head with another, and regurgitating the food into her crop. This is a really good way for these bees to exchange information inside of the hive. Because if I'm standing there and you're regurgitating food into my mouth parts, I'm going to have a pretty good sense of the nutritional status of our whole colony, of our whole family. Because the bees are exchanging food in this way, it's very easy for them to figure out when there's food that's coming in, when there's no food that's coming in, when they've got a lot of food around, and when there's not that much food, when they need to be a little bit more careful with their calories. One of the things that food is used for, a mixture of both the pollen and the nectar that we've talked about, is used by these bees to secrete these very specialized substances that they make in these different glands inside of their bodies. So over on the left here, we can see the mandibular gland of a honeybee. And if you need help to remember where that came from, we've got a mandible that's attached to it. So a bee has given her life in the name of science so that we can take a look at her mandibular gland. Over here on the right, we have another structure called the hypopharyngeal gland. The hypopharyngeal gland is basically this series of balloons all attached to a little channel. The balloons make this stuff and they squeeze the stuff into the channel and then it runs down into the mouth of the bee. The hypopharyngeal gland is sort of threaded up inside the head of the bee. It kind of wraps around their brain, but its job is just to make these different substances and then squeeze them down into the mouth parts. And the function of those two glands, or at least early in the bee's life, their function is to make royal jelly. So these are two queen larvae floating cells, floating in gobs and gobs of royal jelly, probably more than they'll ever be able to consume. But those very, very specialized glands produce this very, very specialized substance. It is important to remember that workers and drones are also fed secretions from those glands. Some people will call the whole lot of it royal jelly. Some people will make a distinction between royal jelly for queens and worker jelly and drone jelly, but ultimately they're very, very similar substances. They might have some slight subtle differences, but essentially they're all pretty much the same. And it's this superfood that is fed to these developing bees. You can break it down and figure out what it is. It's a mixture of proteins, sugars, fats, amino acids, and water. And as I said, some version of it is fed to all developing bees. They're made in those glands. But one really important fact is that only workers of a certain age are able to make jelly. This is one of the reasons that when we're trying to breed queens, or if our colony is trying to requeen after the queen has been lost, and maybe a subsequent queen has been lost, we can get ourselves in trouble if we're asking elderly bees to try to make royal jelly to raise a healthy queen. And this is because the functions of these glands actually change over the course of a bee's life. Early on in a bee's life, she is able to make royal jelly because her hypopharyngeal gland is making royal jelly proteins. She eats protein and the body turns it into royal jelly. But as that bee gets older, she's no longer a nurse. She's no longer making royal jelly. And so instead of just having a wasted organ, she's actually repurposing this structure to do something else. And what it does is it creates an enzyme called invertase. Invertase is the enzyme that helps these bees invert sugars in nectar. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I say sugar inversion. Well, sugar, from a Domino's sugar bag or from plant nectar that bees are foraging on, is generally going to be sucrose, which is a two-part sugar. And if we looked at those two parts and we squinted really hard and we sort of ripped them apart and set the two halves down on the side of the table, we might find that they're pretty much a glucose and a fructose molecule. So we say that sucrose is just a combination of a glucose and a fructose. And if you put sucrose in water and you give it some time, it will occasionally dissociate into those two different simple sugars. And so, if we wanted that process to go a little bit faster, or a lot faster, we could add an enzyme like invertase, which the bees produce in the hypopharyngeo gland. And the invertase just promotes this process of turning those sucrose molecules into the glucose and the fructose, which the bees prefer to consume and digest. And so if we as beekeepers have ever mixed up a little bit of sugar syrup, we know that the ingredients are sugar and water. But how many of you have ever added one of these things to a batch of sugar syrup? Some kind of acid, vinegar, or lemon juice, or citric acid, or something like that. Why do we do that? Well, it's a common practice, at least in some areas, by beekeepers, because we know that sugar naturally inverts when it is held at a more acidic pH. And so the thought is we need to help turn this sugar water, this syrup, into something that's a little bit closer to honey, so that the bees have an easier time of working with it. But of course, the bees have this invertase molecule right there in their own mouths. And so it may not be that necessary for us to go to the process of inverting the sugar for them. We may be able to trust that the bees, with their own biology, will be able to solve this problem. And there's a downside to some of these practices, and there's a reason that it's not worth just trying in the hopes that it maybe makes things a little better. And that is this molecule called HMF. Its full name is hydroxymethylfurfural, which makes clear why we all call it HMF. But what it is a molecule that forms when fructose is in a solution, is dissolved in water. And every once in a while, one of those fructose molecules will get a crazy idea in its head, and it will turn into an HMF molecule. It forms much faster at high temperatures, and it forms at low acidic pHs. So the problem with HMF is that it is toxic to honeybees, and it's toxic even at pretty small concentrations. So 30 parts per million, or another way to write that is 3 milligrams per 100 grams. And the reason I'm giving you that extra conversion is that I'm going to show you a graph in a moment where we're looking at how long it takes some samples to get to that 3 milligram per 100 gram danger zone, an area where we can detect harm to our bees. So HMF forms in high temperature and acidic sugar solutions. That is true of the sugar syrup that we might feed our bees. It's true of something like oxalic acid in a sugar syrup that you intend to use to dribble on your bees. If you have oxalic acid dribble syrup and it starts to darken in color, that's the formation of HMF. And that's the point at which you need to discard it and remix a new batch. But HMF also forms in honey, because honey is also a mixture of glucose and fructose and sucrose in water. And so, of course it's going to form. Honey is even acidic, and so it's going to promote the formation of HMF over time. And so what we know is that acidity and temperature and time are all going to help to promote the development of this molecule. And this was a beautiful paper that was studied where they took 3 different samples of honey and they held them at a whole bunch of different temperatures. And what they looked at was the amount of time that it took that honey to attain that dangerous 3 milligram per 100 gram concentration, the number of days. And so over here, if we have that honey, we store it at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, something that we might find in a hive, then it's going to take, we go all the way up here, we'll see that those honey samples took between maybe 150 to 350 days to form problematic levels of HMF. What that means is that the super full of honey that you've had tucked away at 86 degrees Fahrenheit for a year or two could actually still be harmful to bees if they consumed it. But that's not going to be nearly as serious as if we've kept that honey at something like 104 degrees Fahrenheit, where if we follow this line up, we suddenly start to see that between 20 and 60 days later, that honey has started to form dangerous levels of HMF. If we allow that honey or that syrup to be heated to 140 degrees Fahrenheit and then held there, we find that dangerous levels of HMF can form in as little as 0.6 or 0.7 days. And within 3 days, we pretty consistently find dangerous levels. This is one of the reasons that we don't want to heat up our sugar syrup too much It's one of the reasons that we don't want to heat our honey for a long time and then feed it back to our bees. Now, it's important to remember that HMF is perfectly safe for us to consume. It's absolutely safe for humans. In fact, if you've ever baked bread, part of the process that makes bread turn brown is the formation of HMF. Not a problem. But for a honeybee, it is a much bigger deal. So there was a paper published in 1966, and unfortunately back then, printing was expensive. They couldn't afford to put a whole bunch of pictures and graphs in. And so I want to tell you about what this researcher Bailey discovered, but I unfortunately just have to read a bunch of boring words to you because there were no pictures. What Bailey published in this study, where the project was to study the effect of acid-inverted or acid-hydrolyzed sugar syrup on bees. Bailey writes, heated honey or old honey was less suitable for bees than fresh honey or sucrose, sugar syrup. Their suitability was inversely correlated with the concentration of HMF. But this was too small to cause the harm observed. Bailey was studying HMF. And so, they're like, all right, we know that there's this much HMF, and the bees are getting sick when they consume this stuff, but it seems that there are substances more toxic than HMF, which must also accumulate along with it in heated honey. And so the research, that has been done so far suggests that we know that there are some problems when honey is allowed to sit and get cooled when they're too hot. But we may not know everything that there is to know about those potential toxins. Bailey went on, the bees that were fed the acid-inverted sugar, or who were fed unrefined sugar, so that sugar in the raw maple syrup that we're talking about, the high ash stuff, or heated honey, all developed severe dysentery and soon died, as did those that were fed 1% HMF. And then Bailey concludes, whatever the relative merits of sucrose and honey as food for bees, refined sugar syrup is clearly the only form of the sugar that can be recommended. Acid-inverted sugars that have had this acid added to them, have no obvious effect when they're fed to a colony already provided with a considerable amount of food. When this acid-inverted sugar was diluted to just 1/8 of the total amount of sugar that the bees were consuming, the toxicity becomes undetectable. This probably explains why many colonies that have been fed acid-hydrolyzed sucrose, this acid-inverted syrup, come to no apparent harm. So Bailey's conclusion here was basically that because these bees were only fed a little bit of this stuff that the beekeepers had added acid to, the beekeepers thought they were helping. It turns out that it just wasn't enough to actually poison the bees because they had enough other good stuff in the pantry. So I love giving this talk, but I'm always disappointed by this question. By a show of hands, is anyone in the room an environmental engineer? I've yet to give this lecture and have an environmental engineer in the room. All right. If you knew an environmental engineer and you asked them what their profession does to deal with pollution, be it water pollution, air pollution, any kind of pollution, the answer that they would give you is that the solution to pollution is dilution. If I have a toxic substance and I put it in a glass of water and tell you to drink it, you're going to get sick and die. But if I take that same toxic substance and I dump it in the ocean, and then I give you a cup of ocean water, you're probably not going to get sick and die, at least not from the toxin that I poured in there. And this is a general principle that works for bees as well. Diversity of foodstuff is dilution, and dilution is good. It's particularly good if we don't actually know what the healthiest and least healthy things for a bee to consume is. We can at least be confident that if we give them a diverse diet, they're going to have some unhealthy stuff, but that will hopefully be balanced out by the healthy stuff. For example, we know that dandelion is great for bees, but we also know that dandelion, nectar and pollen, is deficient in some of the amino acids that bees must have to function. If you gave your bees infinite dandelions, they would not do well because they need to have some of these other compounds. So we need to be very careful of monocultures, an area that has basically nothing but one flower growing in it. This can be in a farm, or it can be in a natural setting, right? If you're living in an area that has a lot of Japanese knotweed, it'll produce a lovely flow, but it's not going to produce everything that that colony needs. So even something great like dandelions or sunflowers can be considered too much of a good thing if your bees can't get a whole bunch of different things and mix them together to get all of the nutrients that they require. there's also so much, there's such a thing, too much of a bad thing. And so there are certain compounds, California buckeye is one, mountain laurel is another, that can be toxic to bees, at least in high concentrations. California buckeye, when the California buckeye blooms, beekeepers often see large swaths of their brood die. Depending upon the rhododendron species, some mountain laurels will have that effect. Sometimes it'll just, be a little bit funny. But if the only thing your bees are feeding on is the mountain laurel, they're going to have a harder time than if they're feeding on mountain laurel plus a whole bunch of other different flowers. And that's because they can dilute some of those negative effects, and they can compensate for some of the toxins. So the last point that I want to make here in this presentation is one about microbes and their effect on bees and bee digestion. So microbes are everywhere. They are found all over the world. They are found all over our bodies, bee bodies, and they can have some really important effects. They're often very important in the way that an animal digests its food. So this is a diagram of a cow, and you can see all of these different complex parts of its digestive tract. And each of those parts is going to have its own little community of microbes, bacteria, funguses, yeasts, and who knows what, that are very, very important for the way that this cow extracts food from its diet. I also really like this diagram because they've labeled burps as an important part of the cow digestive anatomy. And so there's a term that you'll often hear people use, which is the microbiome. This is basically the ecosystem of microbes that live in, on, and around a creature. So humans have a microbiome. It's different from a honeybee microbiome. I have a microbiome, and it's different than your microbiome. There might be some things that are similar. There might be some things that are quite different. And these microbiomes, these ecosystems, can have a bunch of different kinds of species. You can have keystone species that are critical to the health of the ecosystem. You can have pathogens, things that can make a creature sick. That's still part of the ecosystem. There are transients of the thing that you detect once when you're sampling the microbes in a creature, and then you never detect it again, and it just came and went and didn't do any harm. And there are specialists for certain organs. There are generalists that can kind of live anywhere. The key, especially for something like a honeybee, though, is that the most important members of these communities, they've got to be continually available to their bees. They've got to be refreshed if they ever disappear. So as the colony swarms, as the population changes, as these bees live spring, summer, fall, and winter, they need to have access to all of the microbes that they need in order to be healthy. And so we can look at a honeybee colony and we can identify a whole bunch of places that are basically reservoirs, places that preserve these different microbes. So if I took a bee and I zapped her and I destroyed all of her microbes, she could go and she could visit stored pollen and honey and brood. She could go interact with the queen. Maybe the egg that queen lays is going to have some microbes added to it. The propolis, the surfaces in the hive, the guts of other bees. If my bee bumps into a bee who has had a little bathroom accident in the hive, she might pick up some new bacteria. The workers themselves, and even the flowers that the bees are going and visiting can refresh the microbial community inside of that colony. So bees have huge access to all of these different microbial structures, these reservoirs. There's another vocab word, and then I promise I'll stop at the vocab, but there's another word which you may not have encountered before, and that word is the holobiont. This is a word that really only microbiologists use, and it describes both the host organism and all of the microbes, the symbiotic microbes that live in, on, and around it, and the fact that they all really go through life as one creature, one entity. If I took all of your microbes off of you and I just put them in a pile, they would die because they need to be on your body. But if I took all of the microbes off of you and I put you in a pile, you might die because you need to have some of those microbes. You can at least get very sick if your body doesn't have the ecosystem it's supposed to have. And so that means that over time, the microbes that live in, on, and around humans specialize on living in, on, and around humans. The same is true for bees. The microbes that are part of a bee's life are specialized to be part of a bee's life. And they're different from other kinds of microbes. In bees, there's a little bit more complexity because they have the gut microbes, the same things that you and I might have, but they also have what's called the social microbiome. this basic collection of the bacteria that are involved in fermenting pollen and turning it into bee bread, for example. All of that stuff is also done by microbes, and so those microbes are sort of an extended part of the bee microbe community. If we take a bee and we dissect her whole digestive tract out, then we can trace from mouth all the way down to the other end the total number of microbes and the types of microbes that we can find. And we can see that some of these microbes are very specialized. They only live in certain structures, certain parts of the bee's body. Some of the microbes are generalists. They're sort of anywhere. They'll go wherever there's food for them to consume. And if we just look at this diagram, we can see that the color, the darkness in the tube that forms the bee's digestive tract, this blue color, increases in density as we go from mouth down to the back end. And that basically reflects the increase in bacterial concentration. Most of the bacteria in a bee's body are here at the back end. There's very, very little up here at the front. And that makes sense. Because obviously, if you're bringing honey in and spitting honey out again all day, we don't want to have a bunch of weird microbes getting in there and trying to digest it. And so the bees have a pretty hostile environment up front to these microbes. It's only when they can get back and colonize the rest of the digestive tract that they're able to really grow and thrive. So I want to talk about some research that has been done on probiotics and the microbiome of bees. And this is work that was done by Kirk Anderson, who's a USDA professor or a USDA scientist at the Tucson Bee Lab. And he did this work in collaboration with Randy Oliver, who writes for his website, scientificbeekeeping.com. So Kirk and Randy and a bunch of Kirk's students worked together, and they tested these two different probiotic products, Super DFM and Pro DFM, which is just a knockoff of Super DFM. And the idea behind a probiotic is pretty simple. It's a live microbe that you consume, the bacteria or something else that you consume, and it's meant to improve your health. It may or may not colonize your gut. These microbes may or may not take residence. It's possible that they'll come in, you'll digest them, and just by consuming them, you're going to be healthier. But in general, we sort of expect that a lot of these things are going to go in and take up residence, that they're going to replace some missing thing that we didn't have before we consumed the probiotic. There were two different products, as I said, but both of these contain the exact same species. And importantly, those species are similar to those that we find inside of bee guts, but for the most part, none of these are derived from bee guts. These are soil bacteria or other bacterial species that just happen to line up with the ones that you find when you dissect open a bee. So I'm going to teach you all very quickly to be expert microbiologists. What we're going to do is look at a number of different graphs, and the graphs are all going to have sort of the same structure. Over here on the side, there's going to be a key that has abbreviations for all the different bacterial species. You can ignore that. Doesn't matter. All you need to know is that when I show you one of these lines, that represents all of the bacteria inside of a particular bee. So this was one bee's guts, and they ran it through a complex microbiology test, and they were able to figure out how much